Welcome, everyone, to Mythstorie, a podcast about myths and history. I'm one of your hosts, Bryant, with my permanent guest, Cammy. Hey there, Cammy.
Hey, Bryant. How are you?
I'm doing okay. How are you doing?
Fantastic. Thanks.
Yeah, so Mystery Show. Every week we pick a topic in myth, legend, what have you. Just had one of my favorite topics we touched on, the centaurs we just did last week, and I'm glad we did. I've been saying for months that we got to do that, and it turned out really well. It was fun listen. So we've got an interesting one to follow up that. We're going to talk about the entities of dwarfs. Dwarves. Both are correct. Just so you know, I'll talk about that
Are
later.
they?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Get ready. It's a wild ride later. Yeah. So you might know these beings from like Lord of the Rings and other high fantasy. That's really where they've been famous. Cammy, where else did everyone else learn from them if they're 70 plus?
The Snow White and the Seven Dwarves, right?
Correct. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So like Brothers Grimm style dwarfs, as in Sleepy Dopey. Can you name the other ones? I don't.
Sneezy, grumpy.
Comment below. Angry.
We're not going to get it.
Vengeful. Revengeful. But Cammy's got a story for us, as we do on the show. And after Cammy's story that gives us a great presentation of the dwarves, then we're going to talk about some of the history behind them and how they kind of came to be today. So Cammy, take it away.
Thanks, Bryant. So I am using the Edwards M. Taylor translation of the Grimm's Fairy Tales. This is from Maynard Merrill and Company, 1905. And I got it from the website, the Educational Technology Clearinghouse, Lit to Go. Our story begins with the daughters of a widow who lived in a cottage deep in the forest. Her first daughter, Rose Red, enjoyed her time in the clearing with nature, while the second daughter, Snow White, preferred to stay at home and help her mother with chores. Both were delightful and always had a happy disposition. One day, when the two were gathering winter berries for a pie, they came upon a bear who was freezing in the cold air. They invited him back to their cottage, and he warmed himself by the fire. When he was sufficiently cozy, he let himself out and returned to the woods. This became a nightly ritual for the family. The bear would come to the cottage and warm himself and enjoy the company of the women until he was warm enough to leave. Spring came, and the bear still frequented them. He told them about his treasure of gold and how he had to protect it from the evil dwarf. One night, as he was leaving, he cut himself on the door's latch, and Snow White saw a golden glow coming from under his fur. He ran off and did not return. The two girls were sad to lose their friend, so they busied themselves with chores. One day, while gathering firewood for their mother, they saw a tiny man whose beard was stuck in a tree. He cried for help, and they ran over and cut his beard free for him. He chastised them for harming his beard and grabbed the bag of gold he had with him on his way into the woods. The next day, the two girls went to gather fish. They encountered the same dwarf again, being dragged under by a fish. They grabbed him and cut his beard even shorter to free him from the water beast. But as soon as he was on the shore and safe from harm, he chastised them again and ran off into the woods with another bag of gold. The next day, the girls were on their way to town to buy supplies for sewing. On the way, they saw the same dwarf being carried into the air by an eagle who had him by his beard. They grabbed onto him and cut his beard again to free him from another peril. But he was still ungrateful and chastised them this time for ruining his clothes. He was so angry he cursed and spat all the way to the woods, a sack of jewels on his back. As the girls came back from town, they found the dwarf again. This time he was not in peril, but was counting his massive treasure in a clearing. When he spotted them, he started to yell at them to stay back. But just then a bear came out of the woods and snarled at the dwarf. He pleaded for his life, offering the two innocent girls to stand in his place to be eaten. The bear didn't hesitate. He swiped him dead with his massive paw. The girls began to back away when the bear called for them to stop. They recognized him as the kind creature who sat by their fire for warmth all winter. He said to them he was really a prince who the evil dwarf had cursed to turn into a bear so that he could take his kingdom's treasure. But now that the curse was lifted, the prince stood before them, not a bear at all. Snow White was married to the prince. Rose Red fell in love with his brother, and they too wed. The couples lived happily ever after, and their mother, who preferred her cottage to the castle, planted 2 rose bushes that graced her with white and red roses every spring.
Hooray! Totally how it was in the original version. Nobody died. Nobody was eaten, right?
That I don't know where the
Right.
Brothers Grimm got it, but
Yeah.
I think the girls probably did survive, right?
I
I don't
imagine.
know.
So I had to remember we did talk about the Brothers Grimm before, so I'm not going to go super deep into them. It was the Rumpelstiltskin episode. I can link that in the description for this video and the show on podcast networks. And we spent a lot of time talking about them because I remember the content for Rumpelstiltskin was pretty bare. It was pretty straightforward. So it's definitely bigger here because I'm talking about dwarves in general, right? So dwarves, and I will say one thing I'll repeat from the Brothers Grimm stuff is they took their stuff. They were smart academics, philologists, lexicographers. That's a fun word, and they were really big into publishing German mythology, and that's what this is. So these guys, being the experts that they are, they basically were the ones who kind of encompassed these ideas that were old, and like we've got dwarves. I think some of the easiest, like older stuff, which we just talked about a couple weeks ago with Valkyrie, is there's the poetic prose Edda and the Heimskringla, Snorri Sturluson, the Icelandic sagas of the 13th century, specifically talk about the dwarves because they did things like there's Brokkr and Sindri, who we mentioned in the Thor's hammer episode 2. And so these guys are really important, and it's really well established, at least by the 12th century, by scholars who are writing this down, that the characteristics of the dwarves and what they do and where we get some of those things. But there's a little bit more to it than that. It's a little bit of an etymological journey, but mainly it's a Germanic folklore and Germanic mythology thing, and just like how Norse mythology really encompasses the Germanic area, it goes both ways here. But like Wikipedia, Britannica, they like to focus the Germanic thing, and I think that's really where the Brothers Grimm story kind of comes from. So the modern English noun dwarf descends from the Old English dwerg, Dweorg. It's a accusative from the word dwer, which is the same word, Dweorh, instead of the G. So tons of cognates in the Germanic languages, and in Old Norse they even have the accompanying word dveger or dverger, which comes from Old High German twerg, which some people go back far, like there's Proto-Germanic that from this word dorgas. So there's this clear kind of connection between these words, and these words all kind of mean, it's tough to kind of put it exactly, but it can mean damage, dream, and there's even some connections to Sanskrit dvaras, meaning demonic. There's also another German word trug, which it's like drug, which means
Like
deception.
Or Draugr.
Draugr, yeah. I don't know if there's a direct connection there. It didn't bring that the beings from Norse mythology, like the zombies. But this guy Anatoly Lieberman connects the German word with the modern English word dizzy, and so he was a linguist from the 70s, and I think dizzy is a good way to kind of put it, because if you think of like when you're dizzy, dizziness can come in like a good way and a bad way. You can be damaged, you can be dreaming. It's you can't always know what's going on. So I think dizzy is a really good way to kind of simplify the very long history this word has. I'm talking thousands of years, like hundreds of years back. Is where this word comes from. And so what it seems like, and I'll throw back to, we've talked about fairies. It kind of goes to that. And as well as we kind of mentioned elves a little bit here and there, I believe. So what Anatoly Lieberman connects is dwarves. That word comes from the infliction of mental diseases and other similar things on humans, the same ways that elves and other beings like fairies would do. We talked about fairies before. Fairies, you're a peasant in the Dark Ages. You're busy. You're doing bread things. You tell your kid, get out of here, kid, go play. Kid doesn't come back. You send someone to go find him. You find a foot of the kid. You're like, that's my kid's foot. The fairies did it. That's what you would do. So if someone had some kind of a mental illness or got hit on the head really hard and they started acting weird, the dwarves did it. That's kind of the connection here that people like Anatoly Liberman and that the stories kind of give us. Now, Norse mythology really gives us a cleaner picture, and I can't stress enough, the Poetic and Prose Edda were made in the 13th century. These are the stories at their best. These were stories that had never been written down, passed through ageless amounts of time, that were finally written down by these scholars, and surely they made them nice and pretty. But there is some sort of connection there, and certainly by the 12th and 13th century, we start having this idea that the dwarves are human-like in shape, but they're smaller in some way. What's really cool, the prose edda specifically talks about dwarves being described as being similar to maggots. I'm going to quote Wikipedia's thing here: maggots that festered on the flesh of Ymir before being gifted with reason by the gods. So they were just kind of like mindless. And Ymir's like the giant that was killed by, I think Odin killed him, and to make the world, like the through his flesh the world was made, and things like that. So the dwarves were specifically there, and they had to be given their reason by the gods, and they made the gods pretty much everything. And specifically for dwarves, Northri, Suthri, Ausri, and Vestri, north, south, east, and west, are given a specific cosmological role to hold up the sky in the directions. There you go. Now, what's cool, post-Christianization of the Germanic areas and those kind of like in the Norse mythology realm, they're still important. The dwarves still sort of maintain their legend and the folklore-ness of it, just like how in Ireland, the fairies were still taking your kids and stuff like that, despite being Christianized for hundreds and hundreds of years. The Norse sources don't necessarily specifically mention them being short. They do. They are small and small and usually ugly. That's the quote. And Liberman, the man I mentioned earlier, he suggests that dwarfs may have originally been thought as lesser supernatural beings. So the literal smallness might have been like that. Like they might have been like sub-gods, and that kind of transformed them into literally being small. So, you're trying to describe like, oh, are they gods? Well, yes, but no, they're like, they're smaller than gods. And like, oh, so they're small. And then that's, like you're stuck with that for the rest of your life. And Old Norse dwarf names include Fullongar, which means tall enough, Har, high, and other things like that. So, and there's even Anglo-Saxon references. They use dwarg to translate Latin words like pygmaeus or pygmy. So there, through the Middle Ages, there became this connection of the smallness that wasn't 100% there. The story, the main sources that we have don't specifically say they were tiny peoples. Now, do you know who was the one who made it? After the Brothers Grimm, of course, in 1812, publishing theirs. But can you tell me who made the dwarves? Who they are?
It into memory? Yeah, Walt Disney, right?
Well, okay, sure. I was skipping ahead even further to J.R.R. Tolkien.
Oh, see, I'm too
Lord
pretty for that. I don't
know.
know.
You're fine. So I think it's really Tolkien and The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings that really did a few things. They really cemented the dwarf image that we have today, and he also really separated and defined dwarves and elves. And because we've talked like dwarves, elves, fairies, it was all very synonymous. It kind of depended on where you were. There were extremely similar names, but he really, for his like, he really though specified these things. That's what he really did, and it's really cool to see. I mean, it's funny because Kyle recently rewatched the whole series and stuff, and I mean, what he made is of course like super it's monumental. I mean, he created languages and a whole mythology that like rivals, Norse mythology on its own. And surely he was, I mean, obviously was inspired by using that. And yeah, it's funny. He actually created the VES plural version of dwarves. It was FS before. And he was like a linguist or philologist. And he just kind of like made, it was funny. There were some funny quotes about it, but he essentially kind of made that up. So looking into the Brothers Grimm, though, to kind of go back 100 years before Tolkien, it's not their story spread like wildfire, and of course their story wasn't their story. It was sort of their version of the story. That's kind of how what the Brothers Grimm did. They did kind of like what the prose edit did. They just kind of specified the stuff and made it really concise in this great book. But the story is traced all over the world. And it can have a lot of different variations, just like I think we talked about it with Rumpelstiltskin in a couple of stories that are similar to this, these kind of fairy tales where there's really specific details, so that they kind of have the same root. But these stories almost always have like the magic mirror. The stepmother it's usually a stepmother. It could be an evil queen. But the dwarves aren't necessarily present, but some kind of person fills in their role. In a Greek version, it's specifically giants. In a Scandinavian version, it's specifically robbers, just thieves. So it's really cool to see kind of how it established in that way. The variants, some folklorists have established the tale is really cemented throughout Europe, distributed from the Balkan Peninsula into Iceland and from Russia to Catalonia, with the highest number of variants being found in Germany and Italy, which makes sense because there's so many different cultures condensed in Germany and Italy. That
Are you talking about just like fairy tales in general?
This fairy tale, this version,
the Snow White.
The Snow White. Yeah, because there's these telltale like things that tell you that it's that story, but it gets these minor changes, and it's just funny. Apparently, in Germany and Italy, that's where they've changed it the most. So
that's like Beauty and the Beast and Cupid and Psyche.
Yeah, absolutely. That is another great way of looking at it for sure. So I love it. The Brothers Grimm. It was first published in 1812 in the first edition of their collection, the Grimm's Fairy Tales. It's numbered as Tale 53. Some scholars, modern scholars from the 90s, believe that it could be directly be influenced by a German countess born to Philip IV in 1533, who apparently at age 16 was forced by her stepmother to move to Brussels and fell in love with a prince who would become Philip II of Spain later. The father and stepmother disapproved of it, though, deeming it politically inconvenient. Margaretha, the woman, mysteriously died at 21, apparently being poisoned. So they think that this is kind of like where it's going from. But again, bringing the dwarves in it, like obviously there weren't sort of dwarves there. So it's interesting to see like if the Brothers Grimm were really like inspired directly by that, where did they get the dwarves part? So I think that this story, it goes quite a ways back beyond that. But it's interesting to see people find these connections, these historical events, these records from the 16th
really neat.
century.
I'd not heard of that. Yeah.
Right. There's another one that I mean, it goes on and on. There's a couple others that are really specific. I mean, it seems like it's pulling straws, but you read and you're like, that's the story. Like, that's the story.
Or were they inspired by the story?
Right. Yeah. It could be like, it worked out for those dwarves, says 16th century queen. So yeah, dwarves, old word. What it seems like the history is that the word comes from these Proto-Germanic roots that influenced. You have to kind of like look at like the dissemination of language, basically, and it influenced basically everyone within a radius of Germany, stemming from there, and it seems to mean affliction, dizzy, damage. Dizzy being kind of the best modern way of summing it up without going too specific. And it was dwarves were an explanation the same way fairies used to be, where something would happen to you a long time ago. That's what you would call it and what you would explain it with. The dwarves, he's dwarfed, that kind of thing. the shortness of the dwarves, their stature really cemented later, does have some 12th, 13th century loose connections if you're willing to go with it, but most certainly by the late, by the Grimm brothers, they were short specifically, and that likely has connections to things like gnomes and what's the other one? Is it just gnomes? I had something else written down. No, gnomes. Gnomes. It is gnomes. There, Choric is another word for gnome, and there's some etymological connection there too. That was a side note I had, but it's
what's
kind of
so interesting about that? It not being an actual word meaning small necessarily, but to dwarf something means to make it seem smaller.
Yeah.
So we've definitely taken that word and made it something else.
Yep. It is. Grimm brothers helped paint that image. Walt Disney literally painted the image and animated it for us, and at the same time Tolkien also really kind of put that. And Tolkien, I'll say, he really helped the idea of dwarves being underground people, miners, handy, and that is totally like D&D taken. And that, like, if there's a tree of dwarf roots, Tolkien goes straight to like where D&D, and then influences so many other games and media today, like Dragon Age and stuff like that.
I am not too pretty for Dragon Age. I love that game.
Right. Yeah. So no, and that's kind of where it is. So it's wild. Yeah. Dwarves, it was a long journey. They've been, the concept has been with us for such a long time, but it's morphed over time, just the same way fairies did. Tinkerbell 1,000 years ago would murder you if you described her. So that's kind of the idea here. So there's a cool connection to those other sort of folklore beings, but it has its own unique sort of spin. So I think that about covers it on my end. Cammy, thanks so much for your story. That was wonderful.
Thank you, Bryant, for all your research.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this was a fun one. We've had some really nice ones. So everyone, let us know what you think. Let us know if you have anything you'd like us to cover. Our link tree is in the description. If you click that, it'll show you all of our links, all the podcast services, YouTube, store for merchandise. And you can also email us, mythstorie at gmail.com. Remember, Mythstorie, all one word, story with an IE at the end instead of a Y. So everyone, thanks again. We will see you next time.
Oh.